LSU is making the playoff this year. It's not going to feel like that after week one. I shall explain. Matt Moscona, Locked On LSU, joining me on the show. I think the Tigers are going to end up at 10-2, Matt, which I think is good enough to get them into the playoff. I think. We don't know what the 12-team playoff era is like. How does the committee rank these teams when it matters how you are seated, 1 through 15, more so than, before it was just like, who are the top 5 or 6 teams? That's all that really, really matters here. I have LSU at 10-2. Does that get them into the playoff to you? I think it does.
I am, first of all, very glad to hear you say that you're not sure if 10-2 gets you in, because I talk to a lot of people in a lot of different media markets, and they're all convinced that their team's going 10-2 and they're getting in the playoff. And there's only 7 at-large spots. There's going to be 7 SEC teams ain't getting in. 7 Big Ten teams ain't getting in.
I'm sorry, Tennessee. I'm sorry, Missouri. You're not making the playoff this year.
They might.
They could. I just don't think they're going to.
To your question, does 10-2 get LSU in? It depends on what the 10-2 looks like, because if 10-2 includes home losses to Ole Miss and Alabama, I think both of those teams finish at 10-2 or better in that scenario, and then LSU losing a home head-to-head will ultimately leave them out. So I think 10-2 could get them in, but not if the 2 losses are home losses to Ole Miss and Alabama, because I think they'll lose head-to-head tiebreakers.
So the way that I can see LSU missing the playoff, and look, tiebreakers are wonderfully exciting, sort of. LSU, if they follow the path that I'm about to lay out, might actually wind up they would, I believe, wind up in the SEC championship game, taking on Georgia, who I think are going to win the SEC, and they're probably going to be my national championship, which is boring, but I'm sorry, they're the best team that I see going to take the field this year. So if LSU goes 10-2, but they lose week 1, as I am predicting them to do against USC, but then they have just one SEC loss, well, suddenly they could play in the conference championship game. But then if they do play Georgia and they lose, as they did a couple years ago, if memory serves,
yes,
is 10-3 getting you into the playoff?
Nope.
That's a fascinating question. Well, but it's the SEC, Matt. I think credence is going to be given to what has historically been the best conference in the country and is again in 2024.
Look at what happened a year ago. There's your lesson. Georgia was the best team in college football all year.
But that was the 4-team. That was the 4-team era, not the 12-team era.
I get it, but it's precedent. The committee had an excuse to leave a team out, and that would hang a third loss in your scenario, a third loss on LSU, and there would be a 2-loss team or teams that would leapfrog LSU the same way that last year it was an excuse to leave Georgia out. The bottom line, Spencer, my opinion is I can't see a scenario where a committee with representation from all over the country favors so heavily one league over the other 3 power leagues. So I think there will be 3 SEC teams in. 4 if there is an inarguable 4th. The people saying there's going to be 5 or 6 or 7, that's just not sensible. There aren't enough spots.
5 is the absolute max. Everything lines up perfectly. The right games are won. And 5 is the absolute max. I think 3 is the minimum. And 4 is probably the number where I think the SEC winds up at.
If you go back and look, and I've done this exercise so many times in the history of the 4-team playoff, and look at how many times an SEC team in the penultimate rankings, right, the rankings that set the bowls. If you look at how many times the SEC had 4 in the top 11, because remember there's a G5, so there's only 11 spots really. How many
G5,
times?
goodness.
It's only a few times that the SEC had 4 in that number. More often than not, it's 3. So it may be 4 this year, but I do not think the norm is going to be 4. The norm is going to be 3. And in a stretch year, your scenario, everything goes your way, it's 4.
I just wonder if the committee will look at LSU with what I'm about to lay out here with their schedule. If they have this season and they go 10-2 and lose the SEC championship game, does LSU next time they do that just bow out of the SEC championship game or rest their starters to say, oh, well, you can't get a real perception? I think that opens somewhat a proverbial can of worms Perhaps. But the schedule for LSU is what I like more than the team. I have questions on the defensive side of the ball. I have questions on the offensive side of the ball, which I think are more easily answered with guys like Kyron Lacey ready to fill the shoes of departing wide receivers. Garrett Nussmeier at quarterback. It's not his first season in college football, like a Dylan Raiola at Nebraska, for instance. But I think they're losing week one. I want your reaction to this schedule because, again, I think it works out really well for LSU. I think they're losing week one to USC. Brian Kelly 0-2 in week one games in his career so far in Baton Rouge. I think Lincoln Riley makes that 0-3. Then they play Nichols. I think they'll be okay. At South Carolina, that's a win. I think they will dog race UCLA. South Alabama, not close. I think Ole Miss is a home loss. Arkansas and Texas A&M are road wins. I like LSU more than Texas A&M year 3 versus year 1. I think Bama at home is a win in a close football game. At Florida is a win. Vanderbilt is a win. And Oklahoma, because it's at home, though I'd probably take LSU on the road even in Norman this year, I think that's a win. So that's how I land 10-2. Only SEC losses to Ole Miss, who I really, really like this year. But I think under this scenario, Ole Miss does not play in the SEC championship game. LSU does. And Ole Miss is a more surefire playoff bet in this world than is LSU.
If LSU gets a third loss, then I would agree. But I think you're also discounting Tennessee, Missouri, who I think have a great chance to finish 10-2 because of their schedules.
They have a chance. I think Missouri more so than Tennessee. Tennessee's got more tough games than Missouri on it.
They are the two weakest schedules in the SEC, right along with Ole Miss. It shapes up very nicely and Tennessee gets Bama at home. Your scenario, though, I would push back on the Ole Miss game for this reason. Ole Miss hasn't won in Baton Rouge since 2008. And where that game falls, LSU gets a bye before they play Ole Miss. For Ole Miss, Baton Rouge will be their second of back-to-back road conference games. They go at South Carolina, at Ole Miss. And historically, it is very difficult to win back-to-back road conference games in the SEC. So I like LSU at home against Ole Miss. I think LSU beats Bama at home as well. I think 10-2 is very plausible for LSU, and it may be the opener against USC. I know LSU's a touchdown favorite in that game, but I don't think that's out of the realm of possibility that LSU struggles on the road or at a neutral site and loses that game. I think the trap spot is the game at College Station. It's the second of back-to-back road conference games for LSU. Mm-hmm. That is actually, Spencer, that is actually the only game that Vegas has LSU as an underdog in right now. They got a lot of 50-50 games, but that's the only one where LSU's an underdog as of right now going into the season. So if you're looking for a trap spot, that's it. But the biggest swing game in the season's Ole Miss for the reasons we talked about. Huge for tiebreaker possibilities. And if LSU wins that one, they should be 6-0. I know you don't think they beat USC, but they should be 6-0 if they beat Ole Miss at home.
You bring up a lot of good points about the Ole Miss game, and I see that. The reason I still come down on taking the Rebels is, this game last year, wild, crazy, all the offense and such. Whose defense do I trust more? And to me, that answer is Ole Miss. Defensive staff continuity. I think they had the better offseason, bringing in talent on the defensive side of the ball. Ole Miss got the number 1 transfer portal class. Yeah, they brought in some offensive guys, but they brought in a bunch of dudes on the defensive side of the ball as well. So that's why I lean towards Ole Miss in that game. I think there are a lot of different ways that LSU's schedule can work out to see them go 10-2. And it might be better if they lose to Ole Miss and they lose to Alabama and just avoid the SEC championship game altogether. It is why, Matt, I am so ardently opposed to auto bids. It's a ridiculous premise. I don't like it. I will lobby against it until we get rid of them in this sport. We took a step forward getting rid of divisions, and then we took the same logic that fueled divisions and we applied it to the conference championship games. It makes no sense. It never has. It never will. But I think with this schedule, it works out that LSU will find a way to end up 10-2. Is that where you have them going as well?
I kind of vacillate a lot. I think 9-3 is very possible for this team because there's landmines all over the schedule. But I'm a big believer in not only who you play, but when and where you play them. Mm-hmm. You mentioned Ole Miss after a bye. They get Bama after a bye. They get Oklahoma after they play Vanderbilt.
So a bye?
Yeah, right. So
I am sorry. Vandy takes way too many body blows on this show. I am so mean.
They deserve it.
I am so mean.
Than anybody. put your resources into being good in sports. Anyway.
Other than baseball, Vandy baseball, legit.
A
Vandy
place where
baseball's
they actually
legit.
put money into their resources, because when there were 11.7 scholarships, they gave every single player an academic scholarship, so they had 35 scholarship players. It worked out for them. They could do the same in football, but they won't. I think LSU, because of the schedule, like we talked about, I'm landing toward 10-2 mostly, Spencer, because I've watched this team at practice. Brian Kelly gives us incredible access. I've probably seen 12 hours of practice of this team already, team periods and everything.
12 hours?
He lets us come watch practice.
Matt, there are media members that will cover a team for an entire season and not watch 12 hours of practice. We haven't even started the season yet.
At the time you and I are recording this, LSU just finished practice 11. Media's been invited to 9 of the 11 practices. We've seen a minimum of an hour in all 9 availabilities, including team.
I think that's confidence.
It's incredible.
That's confidence from Brian Kelly right there.
He's literally done that since he's been that's been 3 years now he's done this here. And I have no idea if he did that at Notre Dame. I don't know what he did at Notre Dame. But I've seen the defense, and they're better. They're not going to be great, but the offense the offense won't be the number 1 offense in the country like last year, but I think they'll be top 10, top 15. And the defense won't be 108th, but can they be 58th? If you close that gap, I think there's a really good chance at LSU. The Ole Miss game a year ago, they went on the road, scored 49, and lost. I think a situation like that this year, you win. So one of those swing games probably falls their way. I think they land on 10-2. But again, it's what 10-2 looks like determines whether or not they're playoff.
Yeah, that's going to be one of the most interesting parts of this 12-team playoff. Final note on that Ole Miss game is the matchup between Ole Miss's defensive line and LSU's offensive line, which could be the best in the SEC, is going to be really good. Princely and Monmielen, I might have butchered that name pronunciation. Chris Hardy Jr., Walter Nolan, like they got guys, they got dudes. And then you look at LSU and you're like, oh, look, a couple of first-round tackles. What do you know? Matt Moscona, locked on LSU. Appreciate the time as always, Matt.
Thanks, Spencer.